Another legend bows out. Jose Aldo has decided to retire from the sport. A longtime GOAT, the greatest featherweight of all time, who still holds records from his prime years ago, and one of the most perfectly technical fighters we've ever seen. He was able to do everything at a super high level. His boxing was tremendous, offensive and defensive. Some of the best kicks we've ever seen before, both offensive and defensive. That Pedro Munoz fight really opened up a lot of people's eyes on how to defend calf kicks. That's a fight a lot of fighters need to study. He has the absolute, bar none, best takedown defense we've ever seen from any fighter. He had amazing footwork, top-notch pivots, angles in the pocket, all of it. Even his offensive wrestling was very good, which he showed against Korean Zombie. His counters were impeccable. He put that on display against Chad Mendes. I will never forget that left hook he landed on Chad Mendes. If you guys want to look back at it, it's at 42 seconds left of the first round. One of the greatest counter shots I've ever seen before. Off of Chad Mendes' jab. A jab, mind you, with no telegraph. Aldo pulls with it to decrease the impact, dips to his left to get his head on the inside, where Chad Mendes is looking to step off to his own left side, getting intercepted by a small right. And Aldo's creating now a target at a place that Chad was not even anticipating. So Chad's right hand actually comes down low, and with a mere backstep and a small pivot to create some momentum, Aldo cracks him with a left hook and drops him. What an insane counter shot from Jose Aldo, man. I always like to say, if you were able to plug a controller on Aldo, you could potentially never lose with him. Think of any fighter, any style in the featherweight or bantamweight divisions, and if you're able to control all those movements, because of how solid he is technically everywhere, you would always win. He was a nightmare against wrestlers. He was an amazing striker that can hang with any of them. Jose Aldo may be the most perfect fighter we've ever seen before. A comparison that I probably like to make to someone like Sugar Ray Robinson in boxing. Sugar Ray Robinson was always known by all the pundits and all the boxers to be the most perfect boxer they've ever seen. His offensive and defensive skills were on par to be the best ever. He had the power, he had the speed, he had all the attributes and skills to be the most perfect boxer you've ever seen. And Jose Aldo could be compared to that. There are fighters like John Jones that might question that claim, but looking at technique for technique, John Jones doesn't do the same as Jose Aldo. He's not as high level with his technique as Jose Aldo. And how can you be when you fight at 205 pounds? Those heavier guys are naturally not as technical or not as skilled as the lower weight class fighters. Like we talk about in that podcast, people were claiming that guys like Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington wouldn't even be in the top 10 of the bantamweight division. And out of the fighters in the lightweight, featherweight, and bantamweight divisions, the most technical fighters in the world, Jose Aldo may be the number one fighter. And not just about technique. When you talk about his achievements in the sport, he's the absolute number one featherweight of all time. His 9 title defense record is still not even close to getting broken by any featherweight. Volkanovski is only halfway there right now. The level of competition he beat is probably top 5 of all time, maybe only surpassed by guys like John Jones and GSP. And in my eyes, in my opinion, Jose Aldo is one of the top 5 fighters regardless of weight classes. An absolute legend of the sport that honestly, in my opinion, doesn't get as much credit as he deserves, and he never really did, even back in the day, from many of the personalities. They never bring up Jose Aldo when they talk about the greatest fighters. It's almost like his entire run at featherweight was forgotten after the Conor McGregor knockout, and that's not right. Everybody loses. I mean, that loss was big. It was historic. It was a story of itself. But when you look at reality, when you be fair to Jose Aldo, just like you're fair to everybody else, there is no way you can hold out Aldo in the top 5 fighters of all time. And from his retirement, man, I'm happy but sad for his retirement. He finally knew to call it quits. And it isn't as bad as some of the other legends that went out in the sport. He did take some damage, but most of the damage he took was in his prime. Other than the Petr Yan fight, when he fought Holloway, when he fought Conor, when he fought Chad Mendes a second time, that was all while Aldo was at the top of his game. So it's a better decision out of retirement than we've seen from most older fighters. And also with his realization of his Marab fight that he just isn't the same anymore. Their plan was to fight for the belt one more time. Their plan was to fight out his contract, returning to his kingdom in Rio. And he even said before, win or lose, he will retire after that one. So retirement was definitely on his mind. And when retirement's on your mind, you probably want to call it before you get hurt out there. And I'm sad. As a long-time Jose Aldo watcher, I grew up watching this guy. I grew up watching ever since he came into the UFC. The first fight I ever saw from Jose Aldo was actually his Uriah Faber fight in WEC way back in 2010, and I watched his entire UFC run live. I mean, speaking of his Uriah Faber fight, one of the greatest display of leg kicks, a performance that people still today bring up when it comes to the excellence of that technique. Of course, you have to talk about his 8-second knockout against Cub Swanson, a double flying knee, a technique that we rarely ever see used in the sport, and Aldo knocked out one of the best fighters in the world at the time in 8 seconds with that. If that were to have happened in the UFC today with the social media presence and everything, that would have went viral. He put on the best takedown defensive display against both Chad Mendes and Frankie Edgar twice. The rematch against Frankie really showed that Aldo is the best anti-wrestler in the sport. Or his second Chad Mendes fight, one of the greatest fights of all time. Some even regard it as the greatest fight of all time. When you talk about both technical skill, as well as a barn-burning back and forth, using every strike in the book, from flying knees, all the punches, all the kicks, everything in one fight. You rarely ever watch a fight like Jose Aldo versus Chad Mendes 2. Still goes down as the greatest featherweight fight of all time. Or you look at the combinations he put up with Carl Lamas. I mean, some of the best combos even to this day to ever be shown. He was the first fighter to hurt Max Holloway in a fight. And also Jose Aldo is an example of an old-time legend that actually rejuvenated his career correctly. A lot of older guys wish they could do it like Jose Aldo did. They talk about, oh, I'm a new guy now, I'm a new fighter, I have new skills, and you're gonna see what I'm gonna be able to do, and then they just get knocked out repeatedly or submitted repeatedly. With Aldo, he actually made the right adjustments to where a lot of people counted him out after that Petr Yan fight. He was on a 3-fight loss streak. He did not look good against Marlon Moraes or Alexander Volkanovski before that. Went to a new boxing gym and put on amazing performances against Marlon Vera, who right now is a top 5 fighter, Pedro Munoz, and Rob Font, who back then was also a top 5 fighter. If a fighter wants to know how to rejuvenate his career after he's old and down, they have to look at Jose Aldo. Not a lot of fighters in history were able to do that. You can probably look at Andrei Arlovski maybe, but Arlovski didn't fight at this level. He came back better and made the right moves, but he wasn't fighting the kind of guys that Jose Aldo was fighting. This is a much different story. I mean, someone who hasn't been outside the top 10 ever in his entire career. Ever since his Cub Swanson win back in 2009, Jose Aldo has never left the top 10 of the featherweight or bantamweight divisions. 13 years fighting the absolute best fighters in the world. Not a lot of guys could say that. The lowest rank that Aldo has ever had in the UFC was number 9. In the bantamweight rankings after losing his debut to Marlon Moraes, which should have been a win for him. Imagine that. The lowest rank you've ever had was mainly because of a robbery against you of a fight that you should have won. That's the only reason Jose Aldo was ranked that low. And of course, with Aldo's career, you can never overlook what happened with him and Conor McGregor. It was an historic event, from the press conferences to the knockout itself. We've never seen anything like that before. In fact, they've never done that before. They never done a world tour press conference and promoted it like they did with Conor versus Aldo. And Conor caught him with a perfect punch. I still wish they did the rematch. But that has to be part of Aldo's story because it showed his progression to get back to where he was. He didn't lose his prime or anything. He was still in his prime, and the second Frankie Edgar fight definitely showed that. I mean, he looked better in that second Frankie fight than I've ever seen him before, maybe besides the second Chad Mendes fight. But he looked amazing, man. And lasted 5 rounds defending all the takedowns, countering and intercepting all Frankie's movements. Absolutely shut him down worse than he did the first time they fought. But by the time he fought Holloway, it showed the new generation has come. The new generation is there to take over. And Aldo needed to move on. He did well against Max for the first 2 rounds of the first fight, but ultimately started to gas out because of Holloway's pressure. That was the biggest weakness against Aldo of his entire career, was the fact that he would start to gas out when things start to play out a certain way. But the thing that was always strange and I always questioned, how did he go 5 rounds with Chad Mendes at that kind of pace, but he gassed out against Max after 2 rounds? Always keeps you wondering, man. And then he took the short notice fight and I watched it live against Max the second time. He wasn't supposed to fight Max in that one. It was supposed to be Frankie Edgar versus Max, and Aldo got destroyed. It was pretty hard to watch live. It was an amazing card overall, but capping it with Aldo getting absolutely brutalized out there in front of everybody and rarely having any moments in the fight, you start to see the decline of Jose Aldo. He fought Renato Moicano, he fought Jeremy Stephens, he tried to fight the other contenders there, and he did very well, but you're still able to see technically he's not the same guy he was before. And that was confirmed when he lost to Alexander Volkanovski in a fight that he really didn't do anything. It was a very slow-paced fight, where Volk just did enough to win, and Aldo didn't even put a good effort. And his move to bantamweight was something that nobody really thought was going to be possible for him, because he was always known to be a bigger featherweight, at least back in the day. But when he fought Conor, when he fought Max, and when you see him against Volk, you start to see that Aldo is a bit undersized here. These guys are getting bigger, and that was true for most of the weight classes. Those older fighters were a bit smaller than the newer fighters, and ultimately Aldo found home at 135 pounds. If you were to tell me 10 years ago that Aldo would be able to fight at bantamweight, I would have called you crazy. But he did it correctly. He had the right nutritionist. He didn't hurt his body going down there. Fighters can learn a lot of things by watching Jose Aldo's career and the decisions that he made, both technically in a fight, training-wise, switching gyms at the right time, knowing where and how to switch gyms correctly, and how to cut weight properly while always keeping it professional. So thank you for the history, thank you for the fights, Jose Aldo. I know he's watched some of my videos before, and if he's watching this one, I greatly thank you for everything you've done. It's been very inspiring and motivating. One of the absolute greatest and most professional fighters of all time.